All right, so we've got this uh, pretty fascinating stack of articles all about the brain. We're going to be looking at connectomics, which
Hmm.
is basically mapping out like all the connections in the brain. It's
Yeah.
basically the brain's superhighway.
Right.
And then we're going to jump into some wild theories that propose the brain could actually be a quantum computer.
That's right. Yeah. It's definitely mind-blowing
You
stuff.
ready to have your mind blown?
Oh yeah.
Always.
Okay, let's start with this Harvard Medical School article about connectomics.
Okay.
It talks about the goal of mapping every single neuron and connection in the brain.
Yeah.
It's crazy, like the sheer scale of it. We're talking 86 billion neurons
Wow.
with 100 trillion connections. That's more connections than there are stars in the Milky Way.
It's just an incredible level of complexity.
It really is.
And it makes you realize, like, how much we still don't know.
Right. One of the leading researchers in this field, Wei Chung Allen Lee, he really emphasizes that to understand the brain, we can't just study neurons in isolation. We need to study them in the context of this vast network.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, it's like um, if you were trying to understand how a city works
Right.
by just looking at individual
Yeah,
houses,
exactly. Yeah.
you wouldn't really get the full picture.
You need to see how they're all connected, how the traffic flows, how the infrastructure works.
Right. Right. So how do they even begin to create these maps? It just sounds so complicated.
It is. It's very, very challenging. They're using advanced techniques like serial transmission, electron microscopy,
Okay.
which allows them to visualize brain tissue at an incredibly small scale, like at the nanometer level.
Yeah.
It's like creating this ultra high definition map of the brain's wiring.
That's pretty amazing. So
Yeah.
what kind of things are they learning from these connectomes?
Well, Lee's research on mice has actually uncovered some pretty interesting findings,
Yeah.
particularly in the cerebellum, which is that part of the brain that's important for things like movement.
Right.
And they found that the connections between certain types of neurons in the cerebellum, they're not random,
Oh.
as they previously thought, but they actually connect selectively. And this selective connection, it actually improves the reliability of information processing.
So it's not just about how many connections there are, it's how they're organized.
Exactly, yeah. It's about the quality of connections.
That's a key insight from connectomics.
Right.
That the brain prioritizes efficient information processing.
Exactly. So it might be that the quality of connections is actually more important than the quantity.
That's really interesting.
Mm.
Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about this idea of the brain as a quantum computer.
Okay, yeah.
So there's this theory called the OR theory. It was developed by Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, and it proposes that consciousness actually arises from quantum phenomena happening inside our neurons.
Yeah.
I gotta admit, it sounds a little far out there.
It is. It's a pretty radical idea,
Right.
but it raises some fascinating questions. Essentially, what they're suggesting is that there are these tiny structures inside neurons called microtubules, and that these microtubules might be capable of performing quantum computations.
Okay.
And Penrose even ties this to consciousness with his concept of objective reduction,
Right.
where he suggests that gravitational effects could be influencing these quantum processes in the brain.
So essentially what they're saying is that gravity at the quantum level could be playing a role in our conscious experience.
That's the basic idea, yeah. It's
Yeah.
pretty mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. It's a very complex theory.
You mentioned that the theory has its critics.
Yeah, definitely. It's a controversial theory.
What are some of the main arguments against it?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is that the brain is just too warm and wet
Right.
for these delicate quantum processes to occur. And there are also questions about whether there's enough evidence to show that microtubules can act as quantum bits, as qubits.
So it's a fascinating idea, but maybe not quite ready for prime time.
Yeah,
It's more of a theoretical possibility at this point.
I think so, yeah. It's more of a kind of theoretical framework for thinking about consciousness.
Right.
But it's important to remember that even just questioning these possibilities, it's really pushing the boundaries of scientific thought. And there's growing evidence that quantum processes might be happening all around us in nature.
Oh, interesting.
Like, for example, in bird navigation
Oh,
and photosynthesis.
So maybe the brain is tapping into some of those quantum tricks too.
It's possible, yeah. This New Scientist article that you sent,
Yeah.
it points out that birds might be using quantum entanglement to sense magnetic fields.
Wow.
So if birds can do it, maybe our brains are capable of similar feats.
Yes.
Who knows?
That makes you wonder what other quantum secrets might be hiding inside our skulls.
Exactly, yeah. There's a lot we don't know yet.
Okay, so before we get too carried away with the quantum realm,
Right.
let's bring it back down to Earth for a second and talk about neurons.
Okay.
So this article by Patricia Churchland, it's in Daedalus. It really delves into how these tiny cells learn and embody knowledge.
Yeah.
And one thing that stood out to me was how she just dismantles that whole nature versus nurture debate.
Right.
Like, are we born with certain abilities, or is it all about our environment?
Right.
What's your take on that?
Well, what's fascinating about Churchland's argument is that she's saying genes don't code for specific behaviors or knowledge.
Okay.
They code for proteins, which are like the building blocks of cells, including neurons.
Okay.
So our abilities are shaped by this constant interaction between our genes and our experiences.
It's not as simple as saying, I got my musical talent from my mom, or I'm bad at math because of my dad.
Exactly.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it's much more complex. It's not, a simple one-to-one relationship.
Right.
And she highlights 5 key discoveries that support this view. So, for instance, while genes code for proteins, natural selection, it actually acts on behaviors.
Okay.
So that means the brain structures that support those behaviors, they're shaped indirectly through evolution.
So it's like our brains are constantly evolving in response to the demands of our environment.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And, she emphasizes this remarkable conservation of brain structure across all vertebrates.
Oh, interesting.
Meaning we share many, fundamental mechanisms with other animals.
Okay.
Yet the diversity comes from intricate gene regulation and epigenetic factors, which influence how genes are expressed.
So it's like we're all building on a shared blueprint, but with endless variations depending on our individual experiences.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's like you have the basic framework,
Right.
but then there's all this variation that's layered on top of it.
Right.
Right.
And it's that variation that makes us each unique.
Okay, so she also talks about how brain development is heavily influenced by experience.
Right.
With brain regions not necessarily dedicated to fixed functions at birth.
Right. So like the brain is much more plastic than we used to think.
Yeah. Can you give an example of how experience can, literally reshape the brain?
Sure. Yeah. In blind individuals, the visual cortex, which normally processes, visual information,
Right.
it can be recruited for Braille reading.
Oh, wow.
So it highlights this incredible adaptability of the brain.
So the brain is not, set in stone. It can actually rewire itself based on what we do and what we experience.
Exactly, yeah. The brain is constantly changing and adapting throughout our lives.
Okay, so another interesting concept she discusses is distributed representation.
Right.
Meaning that information isn't stored in, single locations, but it's actually spread across networks of neurons.
Yeah.
It's like a giant web of knowledge throughout the brain. Right, and she uses Lashley's rat maze experiments as an example.
Okay.
Lashley was trying to, pinpoint the location of memory in the rat brain.
Okay.
And he found that it couldn't be localized to a single region.
Huh.
It was distributed throughout the cortex.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. So our memories are not like files stored in a specific folder on our computer.
Right.
They're more like a tapestry woven across the entire brain.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. So to illustrate how neurons learn,
Mm-hmm.
she describes this bee foraging experiment.
Okay.
Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
It's pretty cool, right? So bees, they actually calculate the expected utility of visiting different flower types
Right.
to optimize their nectar gathering.
Yeah, so even with their tiny brains, they're showing, a level of intelligence that we wouldn't have expected.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So this experiment highlights the role of the specific neuron called, I think, the VUM-MEC1 neuron.
Right.
And it essentially represents a prediction error.
Yeah, so this neuron helps the bee learn and adjust its strategy
Okay.
based on the outcomes of its foraging efforts.
So even a single neuron can play a really significant role in learning and adaptation.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just one neuron, but it's making a big difference.
Right. And this same principle of prediction error,
Mm-hmm.
it applies to our our brains, too. Like, our reward system, which involves dopamine release, is also based on predicting and responding to rewards.
Exactly. So it's like our brains are constantly making predictions about the world
Right.
and then updating those predictions based on the feedback we receive.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because this is also how addiction can happen.
Right.
Because drugs like cocaine and nicotine, they flood the brain with dopamine,
Yeah.
creating this like really intense feeling of pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And that surge of dopamine basically tricks the brain into thinking that the drug is like essential for survival.
Yeah, exactly.
So then the brain starts to crave that dopamine rush
Yeah.
and seeks out the drug, even if it's harmful. It's
Yeah.
almost like the brain gets hijacked.
It does.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the powerful neurobiology of addiction.
Yeah, it's that's scary.
It is, yeah. It's a very complex problem.
Now, shifting gears again,
Okay.
we have this incredible study from EPFL. It was published in Nature Communications,
Mhm.
and it focuses on how the human brain transmits information.
Okay.
And they found something that really sets us apart from other mammals.
Oh, interesting. What's that?
So it turns out that human brains send information through multiple parallel pathways,
Huh.
unlike macaques and mice, which rely on single pathways.
Oh, wow. So we have like multiple routes for information to flow.
Yeah, like a multi-lane highway.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And one of the researchers, Alessandra Griffa,
Mm-hmm.
she uses the analogy of brain traffic.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. She suggests that these parallel pathways could be what allows us to have more complex representations of reality,
Oh,
potentially explaining, like, our advanced cognitive abilities.
no, maybe that's why we're able to think in more abstract ways, you know?
Yeah, maybe. It's really fascinating.
It is.
So now let's talk about how scientists are trying to mimic the brain's power with artificial intelligence.
Okay. Yeah.
This article from the Australian National Fabrication Facility, ANFF, it talks about the development of solid-state synapses in neurons.
Right. Right.
Essentially, they're trying to build a brain, but out of silicon.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Pretty crazy concept.
Right.
So what's the advantage of trying to build a computer that works more like the brain?
Well, you know, conventional computers,
Yeah.
they process information sequentially.
Okay.
They require constant data transfer between the CPU and the memory,
Okay.
which can be quite slow and energy intensive.
Right.
The brain, on the other hand, processes information in parallel with memory, like embedded within the processing system. So
Yeah.
it's incredibly efficient.
So it's like the brain is a master multitasker.
While our current computers are kind of stuck doing one thing at a time.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so how are they actually building these brain-like computers?
Well, the ANFF group, they're using nanoscale oscillators to create artificial neurons.
Okay.
So these tiny devices, they oscillate between states, mimicking the way that neurons fire electrical impulses.
Oh, wow. So they're basically building the brain's information processing units.
Exactly, yeah. It's
That-
pretty amazing.
That is amazing. So what can they do with these artificial neurons? Like, what are the applications?
Well, by connecting them together, you can create oscillating neural networks,
Mm-hmm.
or ONNs.
Okay.
And these ONNs have the potential for, energy-efficient computation.
Mm.
And they also excel at tasks like pattern recognition, which are really computationally demanding for traditional computers.
Okay.
So, for example, they could be used for medical image analysis,
Oh, wow.
facial recognition,
Mm-hmm.
cybersecurity, things like that. So they could revolutionize computing as we know it.
Yeah, they really could.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Let's kind of zoom out for a second, get a broader perspective on the brain's organization.
Okay.
This NIDA video that you sent over provides a really great overview of the major brain structures and their functions.
Right.
It's almost like a symphony of different structures all working together.
It really is.
So first we have the cerebrum, which is kind of the big boss.
Yeah.
You know,
The command center.
Right. It's responsible for higher level thinking, sensory processing, motor control,
Right.
a whole bunch of stuff.
A lot going on there.
Yeah. And it's divided into two hemispheres
Right.
with 4 distinct lobes.
Each lobe with its own specialized functions.
Right. And then there's the thalamus, which acts as like a central relay station,
Mm-hmm.
sending sensory and motor information to the cortex.
Yeah, it's like the grand central station of the brain.
Yeah, yeah, great analogy. And below the cerebrum, we have the cerebellum, which is important for coordination, balance, spatial navigation.
Right, keeps us from bumping into things.
Exactly.
Mm,
Keeps us from being clumsy.
which I appreciate.
You know,
Yeah.
me too. And then, of course, we have the brainstem, which
Yeah.
connects the brain to the spinal cord
Right,
and controls vital functions like breathing and heart rate.
right. Keeping us alive.
Exactly, the essentials. And then finally, we have the limbic system,
Okay.
which is responsible for emotions, drives, and rewards.
Yeah, that's where a lot of the intersecting stuff happens.
Right. So this is where we find the reward circuit,
Mm-hmm.
which releases dopamine, making us feel pleasure.
Yeah, dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter.
Right, right. But as we talked about earlier, this system can be hijacked by drugs,
Unfortunately, yeah.
leading to addiction.
It's a very powerful system, and it can be easily manipulated.
Right. And the limbic system also includes the amygdala, which is
Uh.
involved in processing emotions like fear and anger,
Mm-hmm.
and then the hippocampus, which is crucial for forming new memories.
Yes, very important for learning and memory.
Okay, and let's not forget about the hypothalamus,
Right.
pituitary gland, and the pineal gland, which modulate bodily functions by releasing hormones.
Yeah, they're like the master regulators.
Right, affecting things like sleep, growth, and stress response.
It's amazing how much control those tiny glands have over our bodies.
It really is. Wow. It's incredible to think about all these complex processes happening in our heads every second.
It's mind-blowing.
It really is.
The brain is such an amazing organ.
Yeah. And the more we learn about it, the more we realize how much we still have to uncover.
Exactly. We're just scratching the surface. It really makes you appreciate like the power of this 3-pound organ that we carry around in our heads.
It's pretty incredible. So speaking of incredible, we touched on this idea of the brain as a quantum computer.
Right.
And this article by Stuart Hameroff, he goes like really deep into this OR theory.
Yeah.
They suggest that these microtubules,
Mm-hmm.
those tiny structures inside neurons, they think those could be actually performing quantum computations.
Yeah, so the idea is that these microtubules, they're acting as like quantum bits or qubits.
Okay.
And Penrose, he brings in this concept of objective reduction,
Right.
where he suggests that gravitational effects, they could be influencing these quantum processes
Okay.
and somehow giving rise to consciousness.
So they're saying that gravity at the quantum level could be involved in, our actual conscious experience.
That's the gist of it, yeah. It's a pretty wild idea.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is.
You mentioned that the theory has its critics.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely, it's a pretty controversial theory.
It is, yeah.
What are some of the main arguments against it?
Well, a lot of people argue that the brain's just too warm and wet
Okay.
for these delicate quantum processes to actually occur.
Right.
It's just too chaotic an environment.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are also questions about whether there's like enough evidence to support the idea that microtubules can actually act as qubits.
Right. So it's a fascinating idea, but maybe it's not quite ready for, prime time.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
It's more of a theoretical possibility at this point.
I think so, yeah. But, I think it's important to have these kinds of discussions, even if they're speculative,
Right.
because it helps us to think outside the box and to consider new possibilities.
Yeah, yeah. And who knows? Maybe future research will actually reveal some, surprising connections between the quantum world and how our minds actually work.
Exactly. We're always learning new things.
Okay, so we talked earlier about this amazing discovery about how the human brain transmits information
Right.
using these multiple parallel pathways.
Yeah, the multi-lane highway.
Yeah, exactly. So most mammals, they rely on single pathways.
Right.
But, we humans, we have multiple routes for information to flow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
What are the implications of that?
Well, it could help to explain why we have these advanced cognitive abilities.
Yeah.
Imagine you have a computer with multiple processors,
Okay.
all working simultaneously.
Right.
That computer can handle, much more complex tasks than a computer with just a single processor.
Right.
And the same principle, it might apply to our brains.
Okay, yeah. So maybe these parallel pathways allow us to process information more efficiently,
Possibly.
leading to more complex thoughts and behaviors.
Yeah. It could also help to explain why some people are able to recover from brain injuries
Right.
much better than others. If one pathway is damaged, the information can still flow through these alternate
It's
routes.
like having a backup system for the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
It really is. And this discovery, I think, it just opens up so many exciting new avenues for research,
Right.
into how we can harness these parallel pathways, maybe to enhance cognitive function,
Right.
promote brain health.
Yeah, there's a lot of potential there.
Definitely, yeah.
So we also talked about neuromorphic computing earlier,
Mm-hmm.
which is this idea of building computers that actually mimic the brain's structure and function.
Right.
So what are some of the key innovations in that field?
Well, one of the most fascinating development, I think, is the use of nanoscale oscillators to create artificial neurons.
Okay.
So these oscillators, they're made from materials that change their electrical conductivity based on temperature.
Okay.
And this allows them to switch between states, much like neurons firing electrical impulses.
Oh, wow. So they're really like mimicking the behavior of neurons at this, incredibly tiny scale.
Yeah, it's really remarkable.
That is really remarkable. And so what are like the potential applications of these artificial neurons?
Well, when you connect them together, you can create what are called oscillating neural networks,
Yes.
or ONNs.
Okay.
And these ONNs, they have the potential to be, incredibly energy efficient,
Okay.
which is a huge advantage over traditional computers.
Right.
And they're also showing real promise in tasks like pattern recognition and machine learning.
So potentially they could be much faster and more powerful than our current computers.
Yeah, I think that's the hope. And, because they're modeled after the brain,
Right.
they also have the potential to learn and adapt in ways that traditional computers can't.
Right. Right. It's a very different approach to computing.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so we talked earlier about the brain's reward system and how it plays a role in, motivation, learning, pleasure.
Right.
But this is also the system that can be hijacked by drugs,
Yeah.
leading to addiction.
Right, unfortunately.
Can you explain a little more about how that happens?
Sure. So drugs like cocaine and nicotine,
Mm-hmm.
they flood the brain with dopamine,
Right.
creating this really intense feeling of pleasure.
Mm.
And that surge of dopamine, it basically tricks the brain into thinking that the drug is essential for survival.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the brain starts to crave that dopamine rush,
Right.
and it seeks out the drug to get it,
Right.
even if it's harmful.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
It is.
Yeah.
And over time, this can lead to some really profound changes in the brain,
Okay.
affecting, motivation, decision-making, impulse control.
So given what we know about the brain's reward system, are there ways that we can address this issue of addiction?
Well, I think understanding the neurobiology of addiction, that's really crucial for developing effective treatments.
Okay.
So, we now have medications that can target specific neurotransmitters like dopamine
Okay.
to help reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms.
Okay.
And, therapy, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, that can also be very effective in helping people to develop coping mechanisms
Mhm.
and to, change their thought patterns and behaviors related to drug use.
Right.
And then, of course, support groups can also be very helpful for people in recovery.
So it sounds like it's a multifaceted problem.
It is,
And it requires a multi-pronged approach.
definitely. Yeah.
But it's encouraging to know that we're making progress in understanding and treating addiction.
Yeah, I think we are.
Okay, so let's go back to connectomics for a moment.
Okay.
We talked about how scientists are, mapping the brain's connections in incredible detail.
Mhm.
But what are like the potential benefits of all that work? How could that knowledge be applied in the real world?
That's a great question, and I think the potential payoffs are huge.
Okay.
For example, connectomes could really revolutionize our understanding of brain disorders,
Okay.
things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, schizophrenia.
Right.
So by comparing the connectomes of healthy individuals to those with these conditions,
Mm-hmm.
scientists could pinpoint like the specific patterns of connectivity that contribute to these disorders.
So it's like having like a detailed roadmap of the brain
Right.
that allows us to see exactly where things go wrong
Exactly.
in these diseases.
And that knowledge could then lead to the development of, more targeted and effective treatments,
Right.
potentially slowing down or even reversing the progression of these really debilitating conditions.
Right. That would be a huge breakthrough
It would.
for millions of people.
Yeah.
So are there other potential applications for connectomics?
Oh, definitely. Connectomes could also give us incredible insights into, things like intelligence,
Okay.
consciousness, even personality.
Wow.
So by comparing connectomes across individuals, we might be able to understand how differences in brain wiring, they relate to differences in, cognitive abilities, personality traits, even creative potential.
It's almost like cracking the code of who we are,
Yeah, it is.
revealing like the neural basis of our our unique thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
And I think, as we delve deeper into these secrets of the brain,
Right.
it's really important that we have these thoughtful discussions
Mhm.
about the responsible use of this information
Right.
and how we can protect people's privacy and autonomy.
Yeah. It's important to make sure that any advancements in neuroscience are used, ethically and responsibly.
Hmm.
It's really amazing to think about how much we've learned about the brain.
Yeah.
And yet, it still feels like we're just getting started.
Oh, definitely.
There's so much more to discover.
Yeah, we're only just beginning to understand its full potential.
One of the things that really struck me was how the brain seems to prioritize the quality of its connections
Right.
over just having a ton of them.
Yeah, it's not just about sheer quantity. It's
Yeah.
about efficiency and organization.
And it makes sense, right? I mean, you wouldn't want a brain that's just like a tangled mess of wires.
Exactly. It needs to be structured in a way that allows for efficient information processing.
Right, right. And we talked about how information is stored across, networks of neurons,
Hmm.
not in like single location.
Right, it's distributed.
Right. It's like a giant web of knowledge spread throughout the brain.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes the brain so resilient.
Right.
Even if certain neurons or brain regions are damaged,
Other parts of the network can step in and compensate.
it's like having a backup system for our memories and abilities.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a very robust system.
That's pretty amazing.
It is, and it's also what allows the brain to be so flexible and adaptable.
Right.
It's constantly rewiring itself,
Right.
strengthening connections that are used frequently, and pruning away those that are no longer needed.
It's like a sculptor who's constantly reshaping a work of art,
Yeah.
refining it based on experience.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so let's revisit the world of artificial intelligence for a moment.
Okay.
We've talked about how researchers in neuromorphic computing,
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to design computers that work more like the brain.
Right.
But what are some of the biggest challenges they face in doing that?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is that we still don't fully understand how the brain computes.
Right.
We don't really know how neurons process information.
How they communicate with each other, how they learn and adapt.
Yeah, it's a very complex system.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Right, right. But it's exciting to think about the possibilities if we can figure it out.
Definitely. Imagine computers that can learn from experience,
Right.
solve problems creatively, adapt to new situations,
Mhm.
just like we do. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, that would be pretty revolutionary.
It would.
We talked about oscillating neural networks.
Right. ONNs.
Right, ONNs.
Yeah.
They use those nanoscale oscillators to mimic the firing patterns of real neurons.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the latest on that front? Like, how's that research going?
I think researchers are making significant progress.
Okay.
ONNs have the potential to be incredibly energy efficient,
Right.
which is, a huge advantage over traditional computers.
Yeah.
And they're also showing real promise in tasks like pattern recognition and machine learning.
So potentially we could be seeing these brain-inspired computers in our everyday lives, sooner than we think.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. The field is moving very quickly.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot to be excited about in the world of brain research and artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think this is just, the beginning of a very exciting new era.
Well, it feels like we've reached the end of our deep dive into the brain.
It has been a fascinating journey.
It has. We've covered so much ground.
Yeah, from the structure of neurons
Yeah.
to the possibility of quantum consciousness.
It's uh, it's mind-boggling to think about all the things that this organ is capable of.
It really is.
And it makes you realize how much we still have to learn.
Oh yeah, definitely. We've only just scratched the surface.
Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a really fascinating exploration of the most complex and mysterious organ in the human body. And we'll be back soon with another deep dive,
Looking forward to it.
ready to tackle a new set of questions and explore the wonders of the universe together.